Let's get started right away, inshallah. The first topic that I wanted to talk about is something very personal to me. I don't come from a very religious background, and when I did come towards Islam, I was in New York, and the thing about New York is depending on which masjid you go, you get a different brand of Islam. They don't just call themselves Muslim, they have another label next to them. We are this kind of Muslim, that kind of Muslim, this school of thought, that school of thought, this Jama'ah, that Jama'ah. There are these different names. And we're not going to be naming names in this discussion, but certainly it was the case that each of those groups, some more accepting of others than others, some of them are very exclusive. If you're not part of us, then you're not even in proper Islam. You're misguided and all those people are going to hell, etc., etc. Right? And their majority of their energy was spent talking about how they're right and everybody else is wrong. And yet other groups, their emphasis was on some completely different thing, some other piece of Islam, and they said if you don't emphasize on this, if this is not what you're about, then how are you even Muslim? Right? So each of these groups or each of these kinds of identities, they have their own very distinct, very strong brand of Islam. And this is not just a problem in New York City, it's actually a problem across the Ummah, right? So a lot of times when I travel, I get asked what kind of Muslim I am. And all I can say is the weird kind. I don't know what else I can, I don't know what to tell you. Because you need to put some kind of label there, right? And it is, alhamdulillah, like for many Muslims, this is not a problem. They've been raised in a village, everybody's the same, and they're not going to see a Muslim that looks different or has a different school of thought. But we're in a cosmopolitan world now. You guys are living in cities that are international, and people are coming and they're praying in salah together that don't belong to the same school of thought. No two people are holding hands in the same place, right? And whether or not people are sitting there for the 10 minutes for the dua after the salah or the adhkar al-salah, some people are getting up and leaving, and the people who are sitting there are getting offended by the guys that are leaving. And the guys who are leaving are saying, these guys are so confused, why are they still sitting there? So there's all of these dynamics that can create unnecessary tension between Muslims, right? And it can create a kind of resentment, mistrust, and an unhealthy attitude towards the Muslim community, because we check whether or not they're close enough to us before we think of them as Muslim, right? And so I wanted to bring that to at least in my observation, it's been something that I've learned to let go of and not make an emphasis in my life. When people come up to me and talk to me about them being Muslim, I don't ask what kind of Muslim they are. I just want to talk to them. The fact that they accept Allah and His Messenger is good enough for me. The rest is with their own journey, and inshallah they grow in it, etc. But I wanted to get you guys' thoughts too, and your experiences are different from mine. So I wanted to hear from you, how you've dealt with sectarianism and where you think we can go as an ummah to get beyond it, inshallah.
So just to keep the conversation a little bit more informal and on a personal level, because I think that's the vibe that you're going for. I grew up in a community. Many of y'all, like both of y'all, were attracted to the community that we all live in now because of the absence of a lot of that mentality, and there was a lot more cohesion and unity across the board, but it wasn't always like that, and there were definitely different pockets of the community. So I grew up in a community where there was a lot of division in that regard. You were one type of Muslim, or you were another type of Muslim, or you just were maybe not even Muslim to a lot of the other people. And one of the perspectives that I kind of grew up with was, I had a huge realization about 15 years ago, where I realized a lot of the guys and sisters that grew up in my generation, who grew up in the middle of that type of ideological warfare, a lot of them ended up losing their Islam. A lot of them ended up not losing completely their iman, but definitely giving up on being part of the community ever. And because of this, because Islam basically became just something you fight about. Yeah. Islam was demonstrated as being something you fight about. And so A lot of times when I'm asked a question by students or community members, because we talk a lot about community, all of us do, and kind of our vision and perspective on community. So they ask me, where does your perspective or vision on community come from? So I end up telling them that I grew up in a community that was very divisive. So I just decided to look back at that entire experience and note it down as what not to do in a community. And one realization that I came to is one extreme breeds the other. And almost all of these movements and different mentalities are very reactionary to one another. They all justify their conduct, their behavior, their perspective, their rhetoric against other people. They justify it as a response to somebody else.
Yeah, so when I was learning, my formula became, if I'm listening to some sheikh or something, and I'm very old, so I listen to cassette tapes. And so when I listen to them, if they're in their tapes, they were talking about how misguided or deviated those people are, I stop listening. Like, I don't have the time to learn about what's wrong. I'd rather learn something that's right, kind of thing, There was just far too much energy spent on, here are the 8 groups that are going to hell. Like, okay, can we talk about the group that's going to heaven? Like, so, Omer?
So I think that we can't be shallow about this. We have to be realistic about it. Historically speaking, most calls for pluralism in any faith tradition have actually failed miserably because they were too superficial. They ignored just realities that were going to always be there. And instead of confronting issues at the core, they were just general calls, very shallow calls, very happy-go-lucky calls of let's all. It was a very fluffy call for pluralism. So I think we have to be very honest. Number one thing that we can agree upon, first and foremost, and it's sad that we even have to mention this in this day and age, is that you don't actually become violent against any other group of Muslims, any group of people, period, over theological differences. I mean, Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala anhu was killed by the Khawarij. He was killed by one of, this violent group that the Prophet ﷺ said would resurface in every single generation in some way, shape or form. Basically people that make takfir of other Muslims and people that will kill people and so on and so forth. But when he was asked whether we should consider them non-Muslims, he said, إِخْوَانَا قَدْ بَغَوْا عَلَيْنَا. They are our brothers who have transgressed against us. That we're not going to resort to their understanding and their labeling and so on and so forth. So number one, it has to be very clear that no matter how deviant, if a person is indeed deviant, because these were indeed deviant people, beyond deviant people, you don't get to a point where you start becoming a takfirist and you start saying things about other people and so on and so forth. Then you have to understand levels of sectarianism. There are fiqh schools of thought which have been acceptable throughout the history of the ummah. One thing that has always made Islam very unique is that there is a creed that unites us as an ummah almost across the board. That 90% of the ummah loosely associates with the same major tenets within creed. That's not heard of in any other faith tradition, right? You see sects in other faith traditions, they disagree on fundamentals in creed and theology. We don't have that. So the idea is then fiqh differences are acceptable. But how you act with those fiqh differences, we have to be also very honest that we're not living in a time of Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah and these type of people that knew how to deal with fiqh differences in a civilized fashion. So then it's not about changing, it's not about making those differences disappear. It's about teaching people how to have mature discourse about those fiqh differences without becoming uncivilized or abusive towards the other person.
Yeah, to give you a practical example, I've been in masajid where there's a group that believes that you cannot do masah over your socks unless they're leather. And the imam is okay with cotton socks. Now
I think
they're
you're
not
talking about me, by the way.
Oh really? You're okay with cotton socks? I don't know. I didn't check out your socks. But anyway.
Would you like to?
No. No, they're probably too long. If I put your socks on, they'll be more like stockings. But anyway, what was I saying? Yes. So they see the imam guy lead the prayer and they're like, maybe he did masah over his cotton socks. And they'll repeat their prayer. They'll just go in the back of the masjid and repeat their prayer.
They wouldn't even pray behind me. They just prayed during the jama'ah.
No, they prayed by mistake because they joined the second rak'ah. So that's why they joined in. But then they find out that, oh my God, this guy, his feet are so najas right now. And then they go back and they, repeat. And that to me is pretty disturbing. That's a pretty disturbing, okay, it's a fiqh difference, but it's now become like division inside a masjid and about even something as basic as the acceptability of salah. So it can become pretty extreme. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's basically a lot of times there's two dynamics that present themselves, at least what I've seen. There's a lack of education, and there's an undeniable quality of knowledge and education that so many people have experienced when they begin to educate themselves and they start to learn, is that education and learning will always broaden your mind. It'll always broaden your perspective.
Well, it depends. If you're learning from a cult, then no.
Exactly. And so then there's a...
If you're learning from Nouman.
So then there's a critique in terms of the quality of the education, right? So whenever there's quality of education and somebody's putting the knowledge first and foremost and letting... So comes up the issue of information bias. If you approach knowledge with an information bias, then it's not going to have the desired result and outcome, right? So there's that one issue that...
I'll tell you my thoughts on this. You guys are free to critique them. From an average Muslim's perspective, I have a few observations. One, we don't have a basic education in Sharia or fiqh and things like that. These are not things that most Muslims are well acquainted with. They're just not, practically speaking. So they're going to rely on somebody who knows more than them, or they're going to Google whatever they're going to Google, right? Which means that pretty much all of us are going to have a different conclusion because we relied on virtually different sources to get our answers, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is we're not nearly as an ummah, we're not nearly on the same page on even basic things anymore as we used to be. We have too much access to information and our minds operate very, very differently. So we're going to get different conclusions, all of us, right? And then you're going to come to someone like me or Sheikh Umar, more qualified, and Sheikh Abdul Nasser, and say, well, I heard that you can pray like this, but I also heard you can do it like this, and I also heard, can you tell me which one's right? Because you're going to hear 8 things, and you don't know which one to go with. And in that scenario, I think the only practical thing to do, for me, the advice I have for myself, and I'd have for all of you, is you have to find somebody you can trust that knows more than you, in your community, online, wherever you find them. No, not me, not fiqh.
Not online. Not
online?
No.
Okay, not
absolutely
online.
Not online. That's part of the problem, is that it's online. You can't go to a fiqh, you can't go to a fatwa website and structure your own school of thought and your own practices in accordance with that. You have to have at least someone, even if they're not a scholar, someone that's at least somewhat of a student of knowledge that can properly process that information and bring it to your level. That's actually one of the problems, is the online education. I mean, pure online education.
So that's one step, but there's a problem with that step too. And the problem with that step is when you rely on somebody else for information, they're a human being, right? And they may tell you something that your heart is not settled on, wait, that doesn't make sense to me. Well, that doesn't add up. And then you feel well, if questioning them is the same as questioning Islam itself, that's not true. This religion is actually rooted in you having the right and the ability to ask critical questions. If you don't understand something, or you're not convinced of something, you're not a kafir or a fasiq or a shaitan for asking questions. You can totally ask questions. And you can totally say, wait, that doesn't make sense to me, could you help me understand this better? And the answer to that is not supposed to be, well, how can you disagree? Who are you? You should be ashamed of yourself. And instead of this guilt tripping, we need to create a culture, especially among our people of knowledge, that they patiently answer questions with convincing arguments, not guilt tripping. And not reminding people that, well, by the way, we're scholars and you're not. Because that's just not going to, in one generation's time, you're going to get a huge population of Muslims who want nothing to do with religiously knowledgeable people, because they'll say these people think too highly of themselves and they don't dignify us with intelligent answers. They just say, well, take it from me because I'm a sheikh, kind of thing. I don't think that's going to fly in this generation.
Well, the second thing I was going to mention was that aside from just an absence of even basic education, the second factor that I feel contributes to this a lot of times is the absence or a vacuum of leadership. Good, qualified, trained leadership creates a lot of these dynamics and problems. I had a particular experience. It's going to sound very obscure or random, but with some of my teachers, we actually traveled. I studied in Pakistan, and then we traveled through parts of the country that were like very rural.
Yeah.
So we ended up in like the mountain regions, and we were just kind of going through there, carrying supplies and taking things.
Can
and
we cut this part of the recording later?
But
They went into the mountains in Pakistan. With supplies.
It was like relief work.
Okay, yeah, relief, yeah.
So we were visiting all these like villages and rural folks, and we saw two very different cultures in different villages, different towns. There were some of them that didn't have any type of, like you just said, maybe not like some super scholar, but even just a generally qualified student of knowledge, advanced student of knowledge. They didn't have anybody, and just their understanding of Islam was very warped. There was a lot more sectarianism, a lot more division, a lot more bizarre things in their ideas. And then we came across some villages where there was like a very, moderate, humble imam who wasn't maybe the most qualified person, but had studied for a few years with some teachers. And the culture of that entire village and those people was so drastically different. They were so enlightened and open-minded. And
Because that person was accessible.
yeah, exactly. So there's an absence of leadership that contributes to a lot of these things. And so now a lot of general folks here, I would say, are maybe asking, well, what are we supposed to do about that? That's why it's kind of reciprocal. Leadership serves and builds a community, but communities, when they realize that they have an absence of leadership, communities need to commit themselves and their resources to training and developing leadership. And that needs to be a community initiative. That how do we develop more leaders from within our community, from within our young people? How do we pool some of our talent together to develop young leadership that can help to bridge that gap in the community?
And I think that that's one of the things, is making scholarship so unapproachable, like as if it's a class of prophets, and also this idea that you can only, that either go overseas, whatever that even means anymore, and study and become an alim, or don't touch Islamic knowledge at all. Whereas many of the things that we learn in our institutions now are pretty much what the average Muslim would have known decades and centuries ago. These are things now that require you to become a sheikh, right? Or that you go through this program and that makes you into a scholar or a student of knowledge or whatever you have. These were things that the basic Muslim would know. And so the problem, the way that I think that you, at least in this situation, and I'll say this, I think our situation, when it comes to sectarianism on the fiqh level, is actually not as bad as it's been in most times.
Yeah, exactly.
We're actually progressive in that sense. Okay? Now when it comes to scholarship being approachable, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ. Ask the people of knowledge in kuntum la ta'lamun, if you don't know. One of the reasons for the backlash that the Catholic Church has faced is because there was this unapproachable religious class that, most people that converted from Catholicism to Islam will tell you that when I grew up in my Catholic church, when I asked my nun a question, I got smacked across the face. And many people had a similar upbringing within an Islamic context as well, that if they asked questions, they were reprimanded and they were chastised. What that does is it reflects an insecurity on the part of the scholar or on the part of the teacher. And then it also causes a natural aversion. You haven't solved the problem of doubt within that person, within that young person that's asking.
Actually, you've only convinced them that you don't have the answer.
Right.
That's what's
So
happening.
you have to find that way to speak to them. And when it comes to fiqh, it's a very simple solution. Madhab al-ami, or al-ami wa laysa lahu madhab. That the commoner does not have a school of thought. His school of thought is the school of thought of his sheikh, of his scholar, of the person that he goes to, the person that he responds to. But that sheikh should be approachable. That sheikh should be able to answer questions. That sheikh should not treat himself like he's infallible. If that person does not give answers to those questions, and if that person does not live a lifestyle that's also, indicative of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then that's a person that I don't need to be talking to or going to for my Islamic knowledge. If this person should represent the product that I want to arrive at as well, the state that I want to arrive at as well. And it should be a realistic, attainable state with my own daily living and so on and so forth. So it has to be a two-way street, like you said. You can't have cultish-like scholars or people that put themselves in positions of infallibility. And you can't have followers that know absolutely nothing about the religion, where they can't distinguish the most deviant concepts of the religion or deviant concepts that have come into the religion.
Yeah.
And one thing that factors into this, something we've talked about extensively over the years, is a lot of times the monopolization of Islamic knowledge as well. You just alluded to it, where it's an all or nothing mentality. Either you study for 10 years or then you have nothing to do with knowledge altogether. One of the things that I'm very grateful to Allah for, and I kind of pride, myself on, is a lot of what we've been able to do and kind of how we've approached that, right? That why does there have to be an all or nothing mentality with Islamic knowledge, right? Granted, somebody who studied, maybe a couple of years should not qualify themselves at the level of somebody who studied 10 years, but nevertheless, there should be options at all different levels. I mean, that's why we have something like the Dream Program, and then students come to Qalam at the seminary, and we do Quran intensive, and different layers and levels of qualification and knowledge are also very important, so people can start to develop their own filters for what they're being told and what they're being fed as well.
That's at the end of the day what it is, folks. Like I think it's just about being a knowledgeable consumer. Like the more you're not gonna, maybe you don't want to become a scholar.
That's a good analogy, knowledgeable consumer.
Yeah, because you have some basic information. You're constantly learning for yourself, and as you learn more, you learn to ask more intelligent questions, right? If you never learn to begin with, then you're just going to be spoon-fed whatever you're told, and you're not going to know whether this is right or wrong. You're going to always be unsure about, or you're just going to be, a lot of times you'll just be taken for a ride and taken advantage of. There are people that teach religion and take advantage of people. And that happens in the ummah.
It's collective as well, by the way. As an ummah, we let politics dictate our sectarianism, and what that means is we foolishly buy into the narrative that all of a sudden all of these ideological wars are arising organically in the ummah. And we actually buy into these proxy wars that are taking place in the Middle East, and we actually consume them here as well, and we take them in. It just doesn't make sense. People, when situations are stable in countries, when people have economic and political stability, they tend to get along, even if they have theological differences. When there are other things at stake, that's when the religious rhetoric becomes inflammatory, because it benefits one group's political situation or economic situation. So we also can't be fools and just buy into this and think, hey, now all of a sudden, we have to fight this group and we have to fight that group. We need to be a little bit smarter about not being played by external forces into these arguments and into these wars.
I'll just say a couple of quick things and we'll move on to the next subject. I think that, at least for myself, I realized a lot of people send me emails, right? They ask me questions and they ask Bayina questions. And a particular kind of question is, what do you think about this book? What do you think about this group? What do you think about this scholar and what they said here? And what do you think about this or that or the other, right? So you're constantly being asked to critique something out there that's being said by somebody. The problem is that is an infinite amount of stuff. So you can either spend your time commenting and criticizing what everybody else is doing and figuring out whether they're right or wrong, or you can embark on your own journey, right? Just get on your own journey, do something beneficial for yourself, stop worrying about who is so wrong and so right. They're not going to destroy Islam. That's something Allah Himself protected. They're not going to get rid of the Quran, they're not going to get rid of the truth. If we don't answer them, then all hell, the ummah will be gone and shaitan will take over. If you don't respond to this incident right now or this book, if you don't write an article against this book, then all is lost. No, all is not lost. Plenty of stupid books were written before and nobody knows about them now.
Nouman, can I add to this? I think a very powerful point. When the Quran was still not yet compiled into a full mushaf, there was already a fake Quran in the ummah, the Quran of Musaylama al-Kadhdhab.
Yes.
There already was a person propagating a new Quran, and not a single companion bothered to refute that copy, because it was understood that this was deviant, that this was out of the scope, because there's always going to be endless deviant literature. You have to get to a point where you know your fundamentals and your essentials, to where you can navigate that yourself and you can say, this doesn't sound right and this doesn't feel right.
I was going to say, I met a guy back in New York when I was still learning, and I just decided, 15 years ago, I'm just going to focus on learning Quran. I really enjoy learning Quran. And this guy came to me and said, so you're studying Islam, have you understood what the different deviant groups are? I was like, no. Do you know what this, and he started naming these different groups. Do you know what their corruptions are? This group, this group, this group, this group. I was like, oh, I don't know any of that stuff. He goes, so how are you studying Islam? And I was like, I'm studying Surah Al-Baqarah. And then he's like, but you have to learn this first before you study Quran. I was like, no, I don't. And then I got upset with him. I was like, dude, you don't even know like 3 surahs. Like even the short ones. And you got all these names and hit lists of people that you hate and they're going to hell and all this stuff. Like I have to make a decision. Am I going to learn something productive that's going to bring me closer to Allah? Or am I going to learn something that's just going to make me hate people? You know, at the end of the day. So
is there a balance there? The balance is that you can't tell people to approach the text without any guidance and any mentorship as well.
Sure,
so
yeah.
it has to be, so there's a difference between just pure hate speech, go after them, hate these people, and then learn your Islam. And look, you need to start with the sources, with the fundamentals, with open-minded, balanced mentors, inshallah ta'ala, that can guide you on that path.